Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. 30 years of comics. 30 years. And I gotta say, like, I like a lot of the source material, but also a lot of like adaptations and things like that. And I will be focusing mostly on comic books, but I am going to talk about comic strips because that's where I started with things. And to a lesser degree, I will be talking about manga. And here's the thing, I just made a video on anime where I talk a little bit more about manga and all anime that I've seen. So it's just like, and both of those things, like comic books and anime, or sorry, comic books and manga impact each other, same as like cartoons and anime, right? They everything kind of borrow from each other, and they're the same sort of mediums, but different themes, different tropes, different styles, different cultures, so many different things. But like they've all been a big part of my life for quite some time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick things off by talking about the beginning, and then just take you on a journey, like because again, like the focus is going to be comic books. Um, and that's gonna get interesting because like I've read a lot of comic books, but I've also watched a lot of shows on comic books. I've read graphic novels. I've read novels that were based on comic books, um, and I have read a lot on different comic books and stories in addition to actually reading the comics. And I've watched a lot of stuff about comics, and I played a lot of games that were based on comic books. Watched a lot of shows that were based on comic books. So let's start at the beginning now. I used to get the comic strips like in the newspapers, like read to me, and then read them in return and stuff like that. Would do that with my mom, and that's pretty much where this stuff began when I was like 5 or 6, and that's what I can remember. And then what happens around that time? Batman the animated series came out, and not long after, around the same time, X-Men the animated series came out, and just seeing those shows and having them be so cool and so awesome and just like take things seriously, that led into me getting comic books. And I did get Marvel and did get DC, but I was more of a Marvel kid, but I like comics overall. Whether we're talking about Marvel, DC, or independent, whatever the case may be. Um, and so I would read comic books for years and years. Like I would go to the store and like we would get them, like, we could get an issue. Um, just like once a week, stuff like that. And over time, that slowed down a little bit, but we were still able to get them here and there, and that was cool. And so along the journey of like reading them, though, there was a lot of other stuff that like came with that. And it's just like comics, and I'm gonna get to that, but I'd like to point out that comics are such an interesting medium. They're colorful. They play around with a bunch of different tools to get things across to you. And to me, there's something that are inherently mathematical, right? It's sequential art. And you have so many people that are playing around with the panels, playing around with perspective, playing around with different shapes, playing around with the text, playing around with the characters and proportions, and imitating different things like speed and motion, just in general, right? And I think that's all really cool. And back to my journey overall, because some of that stuff will come back. So, started with comic strips, got into different shows like Batman and X-Men, started reading more comics. Then came a lot of other shows, right? Because eventually, Spider-Man animated series was the thing. There was also, sorry, sorry. There was also Fantastic Four and Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. Um, and eventually on the DC side of things, there was Superman and different versions of the Batman animated series. Like there was like just different follow up series that dealt with the same round, and eventually Batman Beyond, and eventually Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. Oh my God, we're gonna get there. We're gonna freaking get there. Whew. They're so cool. But so as I was growing up, I was reading comics. I was collecting them, and I was having a blast. And meanwhile, there was different adaptations that were going on. The '90s was a good time for comic book adaptations, as far as I'm concerned. And so that was cool. And so I went from elementary, middle school, just like living in those realms and getting different things. Um, and I gotta say, like the '90s were a crazy time for comics. I mean, there's never really a time for comics that isn't crazy, but I think it's just wild because I look back on it and like I wasn't judgmental as a kid. I was just like I was reading stuff and saying, okay, this is awesome, or like if there was something that was like super weird, it's like okay, I'm just gonna roll with it. Like, um, for instance, in the '90s, there was the Clone Saga, and that's a whole nother video in and of itself. But if you know, you know. um, so there was the Clone Saga back in the '70s, but then there's a one in the '90s. There was one recently, a few years ago. That's a whole nother story too, right? But the one in the '90s is the most infamous one because it's just like over 100 issues of just pure insanity and a lot of things going on. And so like I had several issues of that growing up, and it's like I was introduced to Ben Riley, Peter Parker's clone, as well as Kane, also another Peter Parker clone. um, and it was just like I wasn't judgmental about that. There was like one comic in particular where Ben Riley was just leading his own life, and I was like, okay, yeah, do you, man? Um, but it was like so there was the Clone Saga, and that was wild. I jumped around in Batman, so I didn't get the whole Nightfall arc back then. I would later be caught up on that. But what I did have was some Superman comics. Some, just where he was just regular Superman, but there was definitely some in the '90s, like after the whole Death of Superman thing. There was a point where they brought back Superman Red and Blue, and I say that because I thought it was just new to the time, but there was older stuff in the '70s, I think, where they had Superman Red and Blue, but they reimagined that concept, brought that back in the '90s, and for a while, yeah, we had that concept, and there was a point where we followed a blue Superman, and he had like energy powers, and that was crazy. And at around the same time, right, there's just like the crazy stuff with like Cable, that was intensifying. And I remember I had the comic where Magneto rips the adamantium out of like Wolverine, like what? And it's just like it was crazy back then. So I had some stuff on Onslaught, and I know like some people do not like that character. I can think of a few people that I know personally who don't like that character. But anyway, so the '90s were a wild time in comics, and we had a lot of adaptations, and that was cool. Um, Towards the end of that time, we started to get more live action stuff. Like there's the Blade movies, and then we got X-Men and Spider-Man, and those were the big ones for a while. You got Fantastic Four, that was a thing. And meanwhile, on the animated side of things, I don't feel like we had a strong showing, in that early part of the 2000s. But there was still stuff out there, right? And I remember after like Spider-Man animated series it ended around that time, well, like late '90s and stuff, like going into like 2000 or whatever. We had Spider-Man Unlimited, that was a thing. Um, and there's a lot going on within the comics themselves. And I remember I had went down to the ocean at some point, and I got like a comic, and it was like the Trial of Venom. That was a thing, and that was cool. So there was a lot going on in the comics, but that's not the only thing, right? Because I was while I don't feel like there was a super strong showing, at least on the Marvel side of things for a while. DC was continuing to go, and what I think is interesting is like so they had Batman and they had Superman and they had that going for a while, but then eventually they brought Batman Beyond, and that was dope. Like the opening, it's just cool. If you've never heard the opening for Batman Beyond, do yourself a favor, look it up, listen to that. It goes hard. It's awesome. Um, and then, like early 2000s, you got Justice League, which was eventually followed by Justice League Unlimited. Oh my God, I gotta talk about those shows at length because they were freaking awesome. Because you had the shared continuity, right? You had the Bruce Timm universe, as they call it, but there were so many people involved in that, right? And what's really cool is Dwayne McDuffie. He was a big part of that later on, and shaped a lot with Justice League Unlimited, Static Shock, stuff like that, and really cool because like during that era, I started getting into like voice acting a bit more, so it was cool to hear like these vocal performances that made me more interested in that realm. So my teenage years were spent, reading comics and still watching a lot of comic book stuff. But again, like I said, I don't feel like Marvel had a strong showing at that point, in the animated realm. But at the same time, they had Spider Man and they had X Men in the movie realm. So there was that. And so, comics were becoming more prevalent, or so it seemed. I didn't really have the context for it before, but it just seems like when I was younger, they were starting to pop up more and they were having more adaptations, and that was just increasing. And here's the thing, right? So, in addition to all that, right, like I would play different games. When I was a kid, I played Maximum Carnage. Like, and I don't care what anyone says about the game. It's awesome. Difficult, yes, but still awesome. And Carnage rules, it's killer salt. And around the same time that I played Maximum Carnage, I also played Comic Zone, where it's like you're an artist and you get pulled into the pages of a comic book, and so you got like this beat 'em up where you're jumping in between the pages and you're playing with comic tropes, and it's really cool. And so over time, I would play more comic book games because like you'd have things like the Spider-Man series, like you had the Spider-Man series that were kind of loosely based on the movies. So you had like Spider-Man for like PS1. I don't know if that was directly based on the movie, but it just came out around the same time, and I feel like that's what they were going for. And Spider-Man 2 though was loosely based on that stuff, and Spider-Man 3 was a little like the same. Spider-Man 2, that got a lot of hype, right? Rightfully so. It's a good game, and a lot of other games cribbed from that. And I remember in college, because I played a lot of Spider-Man games. um, One of them was Spider-Man Web of Shadows, and that was an interesting one where Spider-Man could switch back and forth between his regular style of combat and the symbiote that was attached to him, like the Venom symbiote, or a piece of it. It got the same effect across. It was a weird game. I liked it at the time though. But yeah, so but let's see, because I've played like a lot of different games over time, and some of them were absolutely comic book games, like the Spider-Man game, sure. But one of the ones that I don't think gets a lot of attention is X-Men Next Dimension. It's a fighting game. I dig it. And speaking of fighting games, you had like Marvel versus Capcom, that whole series, and that was like I played Marvel versus Capcom 2 in the arcade, and it's freaking brilliant through and through. I want that game at some point in my life for a reasonable price. Um, and in college, I would play Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and that's still good too. Um, but yeah, so it's like there's a lot of comic book games out there. Most of them are fighting, and I played a lot of those. And so let's see, like what else? Because like I played Mortal Kombat versus DC. That was a thing. There are Injustice games, like the first and the second one. The Batman Arkham series. There's like four in there, like three that count as part of the trilogy and Origins. And even though I like Arkham Asylum, Arkham City was even better, and that is one of my favorite games. It is really cool. Um, Arkham Knight, it had cool moments. I don't know if it was the best. In Arkham Origins, it was derivative in some ways, but it wasn't the worst. But Arkham City to this day to me is one of the best, and I do want to try Gotham Knights at some point. Um, but let's see, because there's a lot of other combo games. Oh my god, uh, I cannot remember. So there was one. It was like I think it was Marvel versus Nemesis or Marvel's Nemesis. If you all know what I'm talking about, help me out here. But it was like one where there was like Marvel characters versus like these created people. I don't know if they were from an actual comic book or they just made them up for the game. But I remember that was the thing. It was a fighting game. Let's see. There was also like X Men Legends. I don't know if you remember that. That was cool. That was awesome. And X Men Legend 2, which was also pretty decent. I don't know. There's been a lot of combo games, but I've enjoyed most of the ones that I've played. um, so back to comics overall, though, I've had a lot of fun with them over time. Um, and here's the thing, so like, right, they've always been a big part of my life because like elementary, middle school, high school, they were there. And then college, I got to expand. And in addition to like reading comics and graphic novels and novels based on that, different comics, I got to start reading like things like on Wikipedia, tracking down different things on various sites online, talking to more friends who, had different copies of different comics that I didn't have. So, there would be exchanges. And here's the thing, I took a comic book class when I got the chance, right? Like, and it was really cool. So like I got to do things like I got to read Watchmen, like got to do that, and read different first issues of things like Superman and Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, stuff like that. And different things like Miles and Persephone, which were not the superhero fair, but pretty important. um like there was a comic book about comic books. I am forgetting the name, but it was by Scott McCloud. That was one of the things that we read. There is some good things in there. I didn't always like the style that it was presented in terms of like just the way some things are worded, but there's a lot of cool things about comics in there. Um, and I cannot remember the name of that book. But in any case, like I was exploring a lot about comics, and then eventually, start watching videos on YouTube about them too. So it's just like I was hitting comics on just about every scale. Um, and there's just been so many storylines and crazy plots, and I think one of my favorite things about comics is there's a lot that you can enjoy about the characters and the stories, and I personally like how ridiculous and over the top some of it is, because like comics is the kind of thing where it's like I'm enjoying this, but some of this is just out of this world crazy, and I mean that in a good way. So like I said, though, comics have been a big part of my life. From a kid reading comic strips to reading comics myself, to reading about comics, to reading different adaptations of comics, like in like the novelizations of this or that. Because there was like a whole like X-Men series, like the Chaos Engine series or whatever. I forgot the actual name, but I remember the Chaos Engine was part of that title. So it was like, but there was a three-part novel series about that. It was like pretty crazy. It involved the Cosmic Cube. It was wild. Um, but so I remember reading that in particular. And then of course, there's all the shows I've watched and like the movies and a lot of games that were played. And speaking of those movies, it's like for a while like I said, like for the live action, we had Blade, we had Spider Man, we had X Men, we got Fantastic Four, and then we had to start the MCU with Iron Man, and then that just kicked off like this crazy period. And I haven't seen every single Marvel movie, like I haven't seen every MCU movie, but I've seen a lot, and it's just like it is wild. It's a lot to keep up with, and I like that for the MCU movies, that the longer they exist, the more like comics they become, for better and for worse. Like, which I find interesting because I do feel like there's so much now, and it can get convoluted, and hard to keep track of, like regular comics, and but at the same time they're getting more ridiculous and over the top like regular comics, and I like that. Um, but yeah, so like MCU is still big, and what I like right now at the time of this recording, Across the Spider Verse has come out, and if you remember the whole Into the Spider Verse, when that came out, it's just like that was huge, rightfully so, and for Across the Universe, oh sorry, Across the Spider Verse, um, that's likewise huge and kind of like right out the gate, because I think like with Into the Spider Verse, you had people, they were talking about it and it was good, but you had to get more people having more eyes on it, and they were just like, okay, yes, and it was picking up steam. And there's so many people who have gotten a chance to see that over the years and see how amazing that movie is. And then with Across the Spider Verse, people were primed to go. They were like, look, Into the Spider Verse is amazing, and to me personally, it's my favorite Spider-Man movie. Um, I haven't seen Across the Spider Verse yet, but I will get to it. Um, but so many people have been talking about how amazing that is, and it's like, yeah, you like to see it. Um, and there's just been so many different phases of comics, and like I said, I grew up in the '90s, so I came up in a time like where there's a lot of crazy stuff in comics. And over time, I've gotten more exposed to a lot of material from the past, and it's just like, well, if the '90s was wild in its own right, and like largely because of how extreme it is, like let's talk about the Silver Age. That like just some of the stuff there was just off the charts, like, and like I said. So my journey with comics started with the comic strips, and that led into comic books. And like at the time where I was reading comic books, and I was getting exposed to a lot of animated adaptations of those comics, I was also getting exposed to anime and later manga. And both of those things have been a big part of my life too. And it's just like wow, because I'm doing all those things, and around the same time that I got into comics, I got into gaming. So it's like I got into gaming and comics and anime all at the same time. All have borrowed from each other, all have impacted each other, and that's just like gone back and forth, like different cultures blending, different people getting inspired all across the world, and it's been a beautiful thing. And I've found that over time, even though there was a period where not everyone thought that, oh well, these are good things, even though that was the case, and some people still think that way. It's like I've always found people that I could talk to about my interests, and that's only gotten better with time. And even though a lot of people will talk about online and how much crap there is online. The thing is, online is no different than offline. You will get good people, you'll get bad people, you'll have good takes, you'll have bad takes, you'll have people that will agree with you, people that don't, people that are good about how they handle both those things, and people that are not. And here's the cool part, though, about online. I feel like it allows people to connect in ways that they would otherwise not get to connect. And if they don't have people in their lives that share their same passions, their same interests, they can find them. And that's great. That's beautiful to me. And with comics, what I like is like, people might remember, reading this comic when they were a kid, or watching this show, watching this movie, and they move on, right? But we're living in a time where superhero comics, or sorry, superhero movies are so prevalent that so many people are either getting into the comics, or they're just, trying to keep up with all the movies, and they get involved and they get invested. And I know some people don't like what a lot of these movies are doing to cinema, and they're entitled to their opinion and their feelings, and that's fair. I do like that a lot of it's become more mainstream. A lot of it's more commonplace, because like it doesn't take away from my enjoyment from comics. It just adds to it, right? I get to talk to more people about something that I enjoy. And here's one big thing. So before we got more news on the MCU movies, I was pretty sure they were leading to like Secret War and like these upcoming phases, and I was right. And what I like about that is, so there is the whole like there's a whole like a section of like John Hickman's Avenger, so that led into Secret Wars, like this the new 2015 Secret Wars. And so I bring that up because, if they're taking proper inspiration from that, and it seems like they will, then we're going to have a lot of people talking about the Beyonders. And they are wildly overpowered. It's great. It's a beautiful thing. I like how overpowered they are. It is insane. It's fundamentally bonkers. And I like that because comic movies are so commonplace, and because the Avengers movies are going to be big, by the time we get to all of that, you're going to have people in everyday conversation talking about the Beyonders. At least that's my dream. And I like that idea. Overall, comics are really cool, and there's something that are also inherently mathematical, and I dig that because it's like, hey, it's math and it's art and it's cool and it's unique, and there's so much that has come out both in written form and illustrated form and game form and animation, live action, you name it. Comics are big. They always have been. And yeah, they are more than superhero comics, right? That's always been the case too. But I do like me some superhero comics. And I think because I did my other video right before this one, my voice is starting to die. I feel it. So I'm going to wrap this up and just say I'm a huge fan of comics. And I like a lot of adaptations that have come with it. I like a lot of games that I've played with them. And here's to the future with comics. I am for it. I'm for them. I hope you enjoy too, and please feel free to share some things about your stories with comics over the years. I'd be glad to hear them. I'll see you in the next one. Professor Prime out.